BTS rules the global music scene today, but behind those dazzling stadium lights and millions of passionately cheering armies lie dark, terrifying moments that almost destroyed everything they built. What actually happens when extreme physical exhaustion pushes a human body past its breaking point? Which members secretly planned to walk away just before fame hit? How did one stage accident nearly erase their future in a split second? Here are 7 BTS incidents that nearly ended their careers. Number 7. Jimin, the deadly pursuit of perfection. Imagine standing on a massive, brightly lit stage with tens of thousands of screaming fans echoing your name, the adrenaline pumping through your veins like pure electricity. But beneath that flawless, idle smile, your vision is rapidly blurring, your chest is tightening, and your body is screaming in absolute desperate agony. Hey, we all know Jimin as the breathtaking dancer, the absolute perfectionist with the voice of an angel and movements so fluid they literally look like magic. But what most people don't realize is that this exact obsession with perfection almost cost him his life and his career before BTS even reached the stratosphere of global dominance. To really understand the gravity of this near career-ending incident, we have to rewind to the intense, suffocating pressure of the K-pop industry, a machine that demands absolute flawlessness at the expense of human limitations. Jimin was the very last member to join BTS, with a shockingly short training period of just about 6 months compared to the years others had spent honing their craft. Because of this, he lived every single day with the terrifying, looming threat of being cut from the final debut lineup. In fact, he was almost kicked out of the group 8 different times. That kind of psychological trauma doesn't just vanish when you finally get to debut. It breeds a monster of insecurity that constantly whispers in your ear, telling you that you were never quite good enough. Driven by the brutal, unforgiving beauty standards of the Korean entertainment industry and fueled by hateful, unwarranted comments from anti-fans calling his iconic, adorable cheeks chubby during their early No More Dream and Boy in Love days, Jimin spiraled into a deeply concerning, extreme, and punishing diet. We are not just talking about eating a little less or cutting out late-night snacks. We're talking about a deadly starvation routine where he later confessed to surviving on merely 1 meal every 10 days at his absolute lowest point, completely destroying his physical health while simultaneously undergoing grueling, back-breaking dance practices that lasted up to 15 hours a day. You have to understand the sheer physical toll of BTS choreography, the jumping, the popping, the aggressive floor work. It requires the cardiovascular endurance of an elite Olympic athlete, yet Jimin was attempting to execute these superhuman routines on an entirely empty tank. The human body is a miraculous, resilient engine, but even the most phenomenal miracle has a breaking point, and Jimin's breaking point arrived in the most terrifying, heart-stopping way possible in August 2015. BTS was in the middle of their Undercover Mission Japan official fan meeting in Osaka. The venue was packed to the brim, the energy was absolutely through the roof, and the boys were riding the high of their recent massive breakthrough with I Need You and Dope. They were playing a high-stakes, physically demanding game that required them to hold their breath for an extended period, already running on literal fumes, entirely deprived of essential nutrients, severely dehydrated from non-stop traveling and performing, and pushed to the absolute edge of extreme physical exhaustion. Jimin's blood pressure plummeted drastically in a fraction of a second. In front of thousands of initially excited but quickly horrified fans and his deeply panicked members, Jimin lost consciousness. He didn't just casually faint and slump over, he violently tumbled off the stage. The sickening thud of his body hitting the ground was momentarily masked by the booming venue audio, but the sheer, unadulterated panic that immediately erupted backstage was nothing short of apocalyptic. Medics rushed in with stretchers, staff members' walkie-talkies were buzzing frantically, the show was abruptly disrupted, and for a few agonizing, suffocating minutes, nobody knew if he had sustained a catastrophic head trauma or a career-ending spinal fracture. The audience fell into a dreadful, heavy silence, the kind of silence that makes your stomach completely drop. Backstage, the atmosphere was a nightmare. RM, the ever-stoic leader, had to keep a brave face for the crowd while internally battling the paralyzing fear of losing his bandmate, while the rest of the members were left completely shell-shocked. Jin, who always looked out for his younger brothers and constantly pleaded with Jimin to eat regular meals with him, watched in heartbreaking helplessness. Big Hit Entertainment eventually released a statement citing a sudden drop in blood pressure due to prolonged breath-holding during the game, heavily emphasizing that there were no major injuries, but the underlying truth was undeniably tied to his severe exhaustion and extreme malnourishment that had been building up for months. This was a massive, industry-shaking wake-up call, not just for Jimin, but for everyone who witnessed it, highlighting the dark, toxic underbelly of idol diets and the horrifying lengths artists go to for approval. If that frightening fall had been angled just a few inches differently, or if his fragile, exhausted body had given out during one of his more dangerous high-flying acrobatic stunts, like his signature blindfolded spins or mid-air martial arts kicks, we wouldn't just be talking about a briefly canceled tour date, we would be talking about the tragic, permanent end of Park Jimin's career, and fundamentally, the end of BTS as we know it. It took a massive emotional toll on him to finally realize that his worth isn't measured by a number on a digital scale or a dangerously sharp jawline. It is absolutely wild and profoundly humbling to think about how dangerously close he came to losing it all because of the twisted demands of global stardom. Imagine the profound loneliness of standing in front of a massive mirror in a cold, brightly lit dance studio at 3 a.m., your muscles screaming in absolute agony, your stomach completely hollow, yet all you can focus on is the relentless, unforgiving voice in your head demanding that you lose just 1 more pound. That was Jimin's devastating reality for way too long. He would literally pass out during intense dance practices back in Seoul, waking up confused and battered on the hard wooden floor, only to stand right back up, wipe the sweat from his eyes, and continue drilling the exact same grueling choreography over and over again until his feet literally bled inside his shoes. The other BTS members themselves have spoken about this remarkably dark period with a heavy heart, noting how genuinely terrifying it was to watch someone they loved and considered family slowly diminish right before their very eyes. Suga, who has always been incredibly observant and blunt, noticed the drastic, frightening changes early on and often tried to intervene, but when a human mind is locked into that deeply ingrained, vicious cycle of perfectionism and self-punishment, it is incredibly hard to break free from the invisible chains. When news of the shocking Osaka stage fall finally hit the international fan base, the internet absolutely exploded with panic, anger, and deep concern. Hashtags demanding that Big Hit let Jimin rest and feed him properly trended worldwide for days, creating a massive, unstoppable wave of protective energy from the global army. It was a pivotal, necessary turning point in BTS history because it forced a completely unavoidable conversation about the extreme physical limits of these young men who were carrying carrying the colossal weight of an entire company's future on their shoulders. From that terrifying day forward, the bond between the 7 members grew even more fiercely protective. They made it a strict, unspoken rule to monitor each other's health, ensuring nobody skipped meals or pushed themselves past the point of no return. Jimin's incredible journey from that near-fatal stage collapse to becoming a global ambassador for self-acceptance during the monumental Love Yourself era is nothing short of pure, unadulterated cinematic poetry. He had to painstakingly rebuild his entire relationship with food, his own body, and his fundamental self-worth, a brutally difficult, deeply emotional process that took years of unlearning toxic industry standards. When you watch him perform today, commanding the massive stadium stages with such explosive power, radiant health, and undeniable magnetic confidence, it is a living, breathing testament to his incredible resilience and unbreakable spirit. But the deep, invisible scars of that era remain as a chilling, constant reminder of the razor-thin line between passionately chasing a dream and completely destroying yourself in the process. It's a stark, unforgettable lesson that the path to superstardom is paved with literal blood, sweat, and tears, and that the beautiful idol who almost lost it all because of the twisted demands of fatal starvation diet miraculously transformed into the very artist who taught the entire world how to fiercely and unconditionally love themselves.
Number 6. Suga, the secret crash that shattered everything. Imagine the suffocating darkness of a cold, unforgiving rainy evening in Seoul, where the neon lights of the sprawling city blur violently through the heavy downpour, and a young, desperately poor teenager is speeding through the slick, treacherous streets on a cheap, battered delivery motorcycle, absolutely exhausted to his very core, but forcefully pushing forward because the meager paycheck from this dangerous job is his absolute only lifeline to survival. This is the harrowing, deeply hidden reality of Min Yoongi, the razor-sharp rapper, genius producer, and fiercely independent spirit we all know today as Suga, who is secretly harboring a devastating physical and emotional trauma that nearly obliterated his dreams before they even took their first tentative flight. Back in 2012, long before the luxurious private jets, the sold-out Wembley Stadium shows, the Grammy nominations, and the billion-dollar company valuations, BTS was just a ragtag group of broke, highly uncertain trainees living in a cramped, incredibly messy single-room dorm, fighting tooth and nail every single day for a microscopic chance at debuting in a fiercely cutthroat, heavily saturated industry that routinely devours the weak without a second thought. Yoongi's personal situation was arguably the most desperate of them all, having bravely but recklessly left his hometown of Daegu completely against his strict parents' wishes to pursue his fierce, burning passion for music. He was entirely cut off financially, surviving on the absolute bare minimum, and forced to take on dangerous, grueling part-time jobs in the dead of night just to afford a cheap bowl of instant noodles and somehow scrape together enough cash to pay his university tuition. It was precisely during one of these grueling, rain-soaked delivery shifts that tragedy violently and abruptly struck, permanently altering the physical trajectory of his life in a split second of terrifying chaos. As he navigated a busy, slick intersection, a car suddenly pulled out of nowhere, colliding with his fragile motorcycle with a sickening, heavy metallic crunch that sent him flying off the bike and crashing violently onto the unforgiving, hard asphalt. The immediate, searing agony that exploded in his left shoulder was unlike anything he had ever experienced in his life. The joint was completely shattered, severely dislocated, and the crucial labrum was torn to absolute shreds, creating a catastrophic, potentially career-ending injury for any aspiring idol whose future job would explicitly require intense, explosive, and highly synchronized full-body choreography. But the most heartbreaking, gut-wrenching part of this harrowing story isn't just the bloody crash itself. It's the sheer paralyzing terror that instantly gripped Yoongi's heart as he lay battered, soaking wet, and bruised on the cold street, surrounded by blaring horns and blinding headlights. In the ruthless, heavily regulated K-pop training system, physical perfection is the absolute non-negotiable baseline, and any sign of physical weakness, sickness, or severe injury is essentially a one-way ticket straight out the door, meaning all his agonizing sacrifices, the literal hunger, the painful alienation from his family, and the sleepless nights would have been for absolutely nothing. Paralyzed by the overwhelming, suffocating fear of being instantly dropped by big-hit entertainment and having his fragile dreams crushed into dust, a terrified, desperate Yoongi made a monumental, fateful decision right then and there. He decided to lie. He somehow dragged his broken, agonizingly painful body back to the trainee dorm and convincingly lied to the agency staff, claiming that he had merely slipped and fallen down a flight of stairs, desperately downplaying the excruciating pain that was shooting through his arm like fiery, jagged electricity every single time he took a breath or tried to move. For agonizing months, he endured a literal waking nightmare, stubbornly forcing himself to actively participate in grueling, bone-crushing dance practices that lasted up to 15 horrific hours a day, tightly gritting his teeth, holding back stinging tears of pure agony, and severely compromising his dance movements just to keep the desperate facade alive, while his ruined shoulder joint practically ground against itself with every pop and lock. Imagine the severe psychological torment of having to pretend you are perfectly fine, smiling and nodding, while your own body is screaming in relentless agony, desperately trying to keep up with the intense, highly aggressive hip-hop routines of early BTS track preparations, where every heavy arm swing felt like a rusty, serrated knife violently twisting into his flesh. Eventually, the immense compounded physical strain became entirely impossible to hide from his incredibly observant bandmates and strict choreographers. Yoongi physically couldn't even lift his arm past his waist. His face would completely drain of all color during exhausting rehearsals, and his deep secret finally unraveled, leading to a deeply emotional, highly vulnerable, tear-filled confrontation with the agency management. Instead of ruthlessly firing him, as his deepest, darkest anxieties had relentlessly predicted, the company's founder, Bong Si-hyuk, stepped in with incredible, life-changing compassion, offering to fully pay for his college tuition and ensuring he immediately received the necessary medical treatments, which was a remarkably rare, beautiful moment of genuine humanity in a famously cold-blooded, profit-driven industry. However, the initial medical interventions and physical therapy were only a temporary, fragile patch on a deeply shattered foundation, and for the next incredible 8 years, Yoongi performed tirelessly across the globe with a literal ticking bomb attached to his torso. As BTS skyrocketed to unprecedented, dizzying heights of global fame, breaking historical music records and conquering the heavily guarded American music market, Suga's underlying shoulder conditions silently and progressively deteriorated, plunging him right back into a dark abyss of chronic, debilitating pain. Eagle-eyed fans would often spot him subtly but painfully adjusting his shoulder during live concerts, wincing visibly in the middle of a high-energy performance, or being physically unable to participate in certain intense dance breaks, but very few truly understood the agonizing, soul-crushing severity of his daily suffering, until he poured his heart out in his raw, unfiltered solo tracks like The Last, under his August D moniker.
By the tumultuous year of 2020, the constant pain had reached an absolute critical, highly unbearable threshold. The inflammation was so severe that he couldn't even lift a simple, lightweight bottle of water to take a drink, let alone execute the razor-sharp, incredibly demanding choreography of explosive hits like On, or the beautifully complex contemporary movements of Black Swan. The devastating, inescapable reality finally set in with a heavy thud. If he didn't undergo a major, highly risky, and incredibly invasive surgical reconstruction immediately, he would permanently and irreversibly lose the use of his left arm, and his glorious career as a performing artist would tragically, prematurely be over forever. In November 2020, at the absolute monumental peak of BTS's massive Dynamite success, Suga completely disappeared from the public eye to undergo the massive, terrifying surgery, bravely facing the paralyzing uncertainty of whether he would ever be able to confidently stand on a stage, passionately play his beloved piano, or powerfully hold a microphone again. The agonizing, isolating, months-long rehabilitation process was a grueling test of mental fortitude, filled with profound frustration, intensely painful physical therapy sessions that repeatedly brought him to the brink of tears, and the haunting, deeply isolating fear of being permanently left behind, while his 6 brothers continued to shine brilliantly without him. When he finally made his triumphant, incredibly emotional return during the 2021 Golden Disc Awards, stepping back onto the stage where he rightfully belonged, the collective, echoing sigh of relief from millions of fiercely loyal armies around the entire world was genuinely palpable, serving as a powerful, undeniable testament to his unbreakable willpower. His awe-inspiring journey from a desperate, heavily injured teenage delivery boy hiding his agonizing pain in a cramped, smelly dorm to an untouchable global music icon who literally allowed surgeons to reconstruct his own shattered body just to keep his precious dream alive is a staggeringly powerful, cinematic narrative of ultimate sacrifice, unbelievable resilience, and the unimaginably heavy price of true stardom. It forces us to look far past the glamorous, glittering, perfectly polished facade of K-pop and actively acknowledge the brutal, unyielding physical reality that these incredible artists silently endure, leaving us with a burning, provocative question echoing in our minds. Exactly how much blinding pain would you be willing to silently swallow, and how much of your own fragile physical being would you be prepared to permanently sacrifice just to fiercely hold on to the one single brilliant dream that gives your...
Number 5. J-Hope, the tearful departure before dawn. Imagine a smile so bright and an energy so flawlessly radiant that it can literally illuminate the absolute darkest corners of a massive, roaring stadium, instantly melting away the heavy worries of millions of devoted fans across the entire globe. We all fiercely love and instantly recognize J-Hope as the undeniable sunshine of BTS, the unparalleled dance captain who leads with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove, and the infectiously joyful spirit who constantly lifts his brothers up whenever they are drowning in exhaustion. But beneath that glorious beaming exterior and those incredibly sharp, superhuman dance moves lies a deeply painful, incredibly dark chapter of sheer desperation that nearly erased his existence from the group entirely, threatening to shatter the very foundation of BTS before the world even knew their name. To truly grasp the agonizing gravity of this heart-wrenching incident, we have to aggressively rewind time and violently pull back the glamorous curtain of their current billionaire status success, plunging straight back into the suffocating, incredibly bleak reality of their pre-debut trainee days. Back then, they were just 7 terrified, desperately broke kids violently crammed into a single, unbelievably tiny dorm room in Nonhyundong,
where the peeling wallpaper smelled permanently of stale sweat, cheap instant ramen, and the heavy, intoxicating stench of pure, unadulterated anxiety. Jungkook was already a relatively famous, highly respected underground street dancer in his hometown of Gwangju, known fiercely as Smile Hoya, meaning he already had a promising, comfortable trajectory in his local scene. But he boldly and recklessly threw all of that away, packing up his entire life and moving to the notoriously ruthless, fiercely competitive concrete jungle of Seoul to chase a seemingly impossible, deeply unstable idol dream under a totally bankrupt no-name agency called Big Hit Entertainment. The K-pop trainee system is not just a school, it is a brutal, unforgiving psychological meat grinder designed specifically to break you down, weed out the weak, and exploit your deepest insecurities until you either shine like a diamond or completely turn to dust. Month after agonizing month, trainees were being ruthlessly cut and unceremoniously thrown out onto the streets, and the constant looming threat of the dreaded monthly evaluations hung over their exhausted heads like a razor-sharp guillotine. Despite his undeniable god-tier dancing abilities, Hoseok struggled immensely with the crushing, overwhelming uncertainty of the future, watching helplessly as the company's funds rapidly dried up and the highly anticipated debut date was continuously, endlessly pushed back into the frustrating unknown. The extreme physical toll of dancing until his bones literally ached, combined with the severe mental torment of feeling like a total failure who had deeply disappointed his supportive parents back home, eventually pushed his resilient mind right to the absolute terrifying breaking point. One deeply fateful, unimaginably gloomy day, the heavy darkness completely swallowed his signature sunshine. Utterly defeated, completely drained of all hope, and convinced that this exhausting, painful path was leading straight to a dead end, Hoseok made the devastating, absolutely monumental decision to pack his bags, quit the agency, and permanently walk away from the group. Imagine the incredibly suffocating, heartbreakingly silent atmosphere in that cramped, messy dorm room as he slowly, deliberately zipped up his duffel bag, his face completely devoid of its usual radiant warmth. When the other members realized exactly what was happening, absolute, unadulterated panic violently erupted, but nobody was completely shattered than Jungkook. At that time, Jungkook was just a shy, terrified, severely homesick young teenager who had practically attached himself to Hoseok, looking up to him as a fiercely protective older brother and a literal superhero who guided him through the terrifying maze of Seoul. Seeing his beloved Hyung actually leaving completely broke the young boy. Jungkook burst into violently heavy, uncontrollable sobs, desperately clutching onto Hoseok, crying so hard that he couldn't even catch his breath, and fiercely begging him with everything he had not to abandon them. It was a deeply cinematic, tragically raw moment of pure human agony, but despite the heavy, stinging tears streaming down everyone's faces, Hoseok's mind was seemingly completely made up. He gently but firmly hugged his devastated brothers, offered a tearful, heartbreaking goodbye, and walked out of that heavy door into the cold, unforgiving streets of Seoul, fully intending to abandon the brutal entertainment industry forever and just disappear into a normal, quiet life. But this is exactly where the monumental, fiercely unyielding leadership of RM, known then as Rap Monster, dramatically altered the entire course of music history. Namjoon immediately recognized the catastrophic, absolutely apocalyptic magnitude of this loss. He knew with crystal clear, terrifying certainty that a BTS without Jungkook was fundamentally, essentially a car without a functioning engine, a body without a beating soul. While the rest of the dorm was drowning in heavy despair, Namjoon fiercely wiped his tears, marched straight into the intimidating office of the company's founder, Bang Si-hyuk, and aggressively put his own entire career and future directly on the line. In a wildly bold, incredibly desperate move that could have easily gotten him immediately fired for insubordination, Namjoon fiercely argued and aggressively pleaded with the management, passionately declaring that Jung Ho-sok was the absolute, irreplaceable bridge between the rappers and the vocalists, the undeniable core of their performance, and that if they lost him, the entire BTS project would instantly and irreparably collapse into dust. It was an incredibly tense, agonizingly painful waiting period, filled with frantic, desperate phone calls and heavily emotional text messages begging Ho-sok to reconsider his life-altering choice. Meanwhile, Ho-sok himself was sitting alone, staring blankly at a bus ticket, feeling completely torn apart by the agonizing pain of his shattered dreams and the strangely powerful, unbreakable gravitational pull of the profound brotherhood he had violently forged in that tiny, miserable dorm room. In a beautiful, miraculous twist of fate that literally saved the future of the group, Ho-sok powerfully realized that his immense, unwavering trust in his 6 members was ultimately vastly stronger than his paralyzing fear of failure. He slowly turned around, heavily walked back into that incredibly messy, tear-stained dorm room, and quietly unpacked his bag, instantly bringing a massive, overwhelming wave of relief and joyous tears to the desperate boys who were waiting for him. It is absolutely wild, deeply chilling, and profoundly humbling to sit back and actively realize just how incredibly fragile the origins of the world's biggest musical phenomenon truly were. If Ho-sok had actually boarded that bus, if Namjoon hadn't fiercely fought for him, or if Jungkook's desperate, heartbreaking tears hadn't heavily weighed on his mind, the incredibly explosive, globally beloved rap line dynamic would never have existed. The wildly flawless, heavily synchronized choreography would have entirely lacked its captain, and the vibrant, beating heart of BTS would have been tragically, permanently silenced before it had the chance to proudly scream its name to the world. Every single time you watch him absolutely dominate a massive stage today, aggressively commanding the roaring crowd with his fiery, undeniable stage presence, it is an incredible living testament to the sheer power of choosing hope over despair in the absolute darkest of times. It leaves us staring deeply into the incredibly volatile, completely unpredictable nature of destiny, forcefully demanding an incredibly tough, deeply provocative question. What would you actually do if you were standing alone at the absolute terrifying edge of giving up your one true passion, perfectly poised to permanently walk away, and the only single thing calling you back was the blind, foolish, completely unproven belief of the very friends who are struggling right there in the dirt beside you?
Number 4. Jungkook, the breathless collapse in Santiago. Imagine carrying the crushing, monumental weight of the entire world on your surprisingly young shoulders, bearing the incredibly prestigious but terrifyingly heavy title of the Golden Maknae, a nickname that essentially demands absolute, unyielding perfection in every single breath you take, every note you sing, and every step you dance. Jungkook is universally known as the unstoppable, fiercely talented powerhouse of BTS, the prodigious center who miraculously excels at absolutely everything he touches, radiating an aura of invincible, superhuman strength that makes it incredibly easy to forget that beneath all that muscle and sheer talent is still a fragile, deeply human heart. But what happens when the supposedly invincible golden boy pushes his mortal body so far past its breaking point that his very life forcefully threatens to slip through his fingers in front of thousands of screaming fans? To truly comprehend the terrifying magnitude of this near-tragic incident, we must violently thrust ourselves back to the sweltering, incredibly intense atmosphere of March 2017 during the massively ambitious globe-trotting Wings tour. BTS had just begun their explosive, unstoppable ascent into true global superstardom, and the pressure to deliver a flawlessly spectacular, mind-bending performance was at an all-time suffocating high. They were scheduled to perform 2 wildly sold-out back-to-back shows at the massive Movistar Arena in Santiago, Chile, a country where the passion of the Latin American armies is legendary, generating an electrifying, deafening energy that is as incredibly intoxicating as it is physically demanding to match. But the unforgiving combination of severe jet lag from traveling halfway across the entire planet, the dizzying, suffocating effects of high altitude, the dangerously poor ventilation in the humid, heavily packed arena, and an absolutely brutal, relentless set list that featured highly aggressive, physically punishing choreography like fire, blood, sweat, and tears, and dope created a deadly, invisible trap perfectly designed to destroy a human body. Jungkook, being the absolute core of the group's performance, was executing the most demanding dance breaks and belting out the most difficult vocal runs without a single second to catch his breath. As the grueling concert progressed, a chilling, terrifying change began to wash over him. His normally vibrant, glowing skin turned a sickly, alarming shade of translucent pale. His eyes completely lost their fierce signature focus, glazing over with a dangerous, hollow exhaustion, and his incredibly powerful body began to visibly, violently tremble under the blazing stadium lights. What the wildly cheering fans in the audience couldn't possibly see was the absolute, unadulterated nightmare unfolding in the suffocating darkness of the backstage area every single time the lights went down. The highly acclaimed documentary series Burn the Stage later bravely peeled back the glamorous curtain to reveal the horrifying, heavily censored truth. The moment Jungkook stepped off the stage for a rapid costume change, his legs completely gave out beneath him and he collapsed into a terrifying, limp heap of sweat and pure exhaustion. Total, blinding panic instantly erupted among the deeply stressed crew. Desperate medics aggressively rushed in, frantically strapping a heavy oxygen mask over his pale face, unbuttoning his soaked shirt to literally fan air onto his overheated chest, and barking frantic medical assessments, while the deafening roar of the oblivious crowd violently echoed through the concrete walls. It was a deeply agonizing, heartbreakingly raw scene of pure, unfiltered vulnerability. The supposedly invincible golden boy was literally gasping, heavily fighting for every single breath, his chest violently heaving as if he were actively drowning on dry land. The other members were visibly, intensely, deeply horrified, completely paralyzed by a profound, agonizing helplessness as they watched their precious youngest brother, the very boy they had practically raised from a shy, terrified teenager, visibly dying of exhaustion right in front of their tear-filled eyes. RM, carrying the incredibly heavy, unforgiving burden of leadership, was caught in an impossible, soul-crushing dilemma. The concert had to continue. The massive crowd was waiting, but the very real, terrifying possibility of Jungkook suffering a catastrophic, potentially fatal cardiac event or severe neurological damage from oxygen deprivation was staring him right in the face. RM frantically paced the cramped backstage area, his mind violently racing, repeatedly checking on Jungkook with a deeply pained, incredibly worried expression, heavily considering making the unprecedented, highly risky decision to completely halt the massive show and immediately rush him to a hospital. But this is exactly where the terrifyingly beautiful, incredibly reckless, and fiercely unyielding dedication of Jungkook dangerously borders on pure madness. Despite being practically unconscious just seconds prior, despite his muscles screaming in agonizing, fiery pain, and his lungs burning for oxygen, Jungkook fiercely ripped the medical mask off his face, aggressively pushed the desperately protesting medics away, and stubbornly forced himself back onto his trembling feet.
Driven by an incredibly fierce, almost entirely irrational love for the fans who had waited years to see them, and a paralyzing, deeply ingrained fear of disappointing his beloved Hyungs, he completely refused to step down, stubbornly declaring that since they might never return to Chile, he would rather literally die on that stage than give anything less than absolute perfection. He marched right back out under those blinding, unforgiving lights, miraculously masking his severe agony with a bright, flawlessly practiced idol smile, heavily relying on pure, unadulterated adrenaline and sheer, terrifying willpower to violently force his failing body through the final, physically grueling stages of the concert. It was a breathtaking, monumentally awe-inspiring display of extreme professionalism, but it was incredibly dangerous. If his exhausted heart had aggressively given out during one of those massive, explosive jumps, or if he had violently fainted mid-choreography and crashed headfirst onto the hard stage, we would be deeply mourning a tragedy of unprecedented, catastrophic proportions, forever altering the landscape of global pop music. The deep, heavy, emotional aftermath of that terrifying night fundamentally shifted the dynamic of BTS forever, serving as a brutal, unforgettable wake-up call about the highly destructive, incredibly toxic nature of their own relentless ambition. When they finally returned to the quiet safety of their hotel, the overwhelming heavy guilt deeply consumed the older members. RM emotionally confessed his profound, agonizing fear of losing him, while a deeply shaken Jimin powerfully noted that seeing Jungkook push himself to the absolute brink of destruction made him fiercely realize that they were all running on borrowed time. It is a wildly dramatic, profoundly sobering reality check that forcefully shatters the perfectly polished, glittering illusion of the K-pop machine, exposing the raw, bleeding human cost of delivering those flawless, viral performances that we so easily take for granted. Think about the astronomical mental toll it takes on a young person to constantly push past the absolute limits of human biology just to avoid disappointing millions of adoring strangers. The sheer scale of that mental burden is enough to break even the most hardened veteran, let alone someone who spent their entire youth navigating the crushing pressures of unprecedented global fame. Jungkook's incredibly harrowing brush with total physical collapse is not just a passing anecdote, it is a permanent, deeply chilling reminder of the unimaginable, heavily guarded sacrifices made in the relentless pursuit of global superstardom, and a massive testament to his terrifying, unbreakable devotion to his craft. Every time you watch him effortlessly glide across a stadium stage, radiating that untouchable, godlike confidence, you are actively watching a man who literally stared into the dark, terrifying abyss of total bodily failure and stubbornly refused to blink. It begs an incredibly heavy, deeply thought-provoking question that demands serious reflection. When your intense, burning passion pushes you so dangerously close to the absolute fatal edge of self-destruction, at what exact agonizing point do you finally draw the line between bravely giving it your all and tragically losing yourself forever?
Number 3. RM, the chilling crosshairs of hatred. Imagine being the brilliant, heavily burdened architect of a massive, soaring musical empire, the fiercely intelligent, relentlessly hard-working leader who literally brought the entire group together from absolute scratch, only to find yourself staring directly down the terrifying, highly literal barrel of a loaded gun wielded by the very anonymous public you were desperately trying to inspire. We all know Kim Namjoon, famously known as RM, as the towering, incredibly eloquent pillar of BTS, the genius wordsmith who confidently addresses the United Nations and perfectly translates the group's deepest, most vulnerable emotions into universally beloved, chart-topping masterpieces.
But what most casual observers completely fail to realize is that the incredibly heavy, suffocating crown of leadership nearly crushed his spirit entirely, pushing him into a terrifyingly dark, deeply dangerous psychological abyss that was violently exacerbated by a highly credible, utterly horrifying threat to his actual physical life. To fully comprehend the sheer, paralyzing terror of this profoundly dark chapter, we have to violently yank ourselves back to the highly turbulent, incredibly unstable era of 2014 and 2015, a time when BTS was desperately fighting for their literal survival in the fiercely competitive K-pop industry, aggressively trying to carve out a unique identity while being constantly, mercilessly battered by severe, unwarranted criticism from both the underground hip-hop scene and mainstream idol fans. Before the horrifying climax of this era even occurred, the fragile foundation of his mental health was already heavily fractured by the infamous, widely circulated Be Free incident, where RM and Suga were publicly, ruthlessly humiliated in front of a live broadcast audience by veteran underground rappers who severely mocked their agonizing choice to become idols, cruelly accusing them of completely selling out their authentic artistic integrity for cheap, heavily manufactured pop fame. That deeply scarring, incredibly humiliating public attack viciously planted the dark, poisonous seeds of intense self-hatred, severe imposter syndrome, and crippling doubt about whether he was actually destroying his own musical soul by staying in the group. But the absolute horrifying peak of this unbearable, soul-crushing pressure violently erupted during their highly anticipated The Red Bullet tour in the United States, specifically during what was supposed to be a triumphant, wildly celebratory sold-out show at the massive Best Buy Theater in New York City. Right in the middle of this incredibly chaotic, high-stakes international tour, a completely unhinged, deeply malicious user on social media posted a chilling, terrifyingly specific death threat aimed directly at RM, accompanied by a horrifyingly graphic, incredibly realistic picture of a loaded firearm and a dark, twisted promise to assassinate the young leader the very moment he stepped onto the brightly lit stage. This wasn't just a casual, easily ignorable internet troll blowing off steam. The threat was deemed so incredibly severe, so terrifyingly credible by local law enforcement that the New York City Police Department and heavily armed venue security completely flooded the backstage area, instantly transforming a joyous musical celebration into a highly tense, terrifyingly active crime scene. Imagine the sheer, paralyzing horror heavily gripping RM's chest as he was abruptly pulled aside by frantic, highly trained security personnel, violently informed that someone hiding in the screaming, tightly packed crowd of thousands of fans might actually be waiting for the perfect, agonizing moment to literally end his life in a split second of unimaginable violence. The concert was immediately, aggressively thrown into absolute chaos. The highly anticipated, deeply personal, high-touch fan greeting event was completely canceled. The carefully planned setlist was severely slashed in half, and the terrified boys were hurriedly, frantically rushed off the stage under heavy, terrifyingly tight armed guard, their bewildered, pale faces vividly reflecting the grim, undeniable reality that their incredible soaring dream could violently end in literal bloodshed right there in America. When the news of the violent death threat finally leaked to the international public, a massive, unprecedented wave of global shock and profound outrage furiously swept through the entire fan base, dramatically forcing big hit entertainment to completely reevaluate their entire security protocol and fiercely prioritizing the physical safety of their artists above any touring profits. Imagine the absolute gut-wrenching terror of the other 6 members, fiercely protective but entirely helpless, watching their supposedly unshakable, deeply respected leader being completely surrounded by police officers, knowing that any single loud pop from the audience could mean the violent, bloody end of the exact person who had literally sacrificed his entire youth to fiercely bring them all together. For RM, this terrifying, deeply traumatic incident wasn't just a brief passing scare to be brushed off. It was a devastating, monumental psychological blow that violently shattered his fragile sense of personal safety, brutally forcing him to confront the horrifying, incredibly twisted and deadly price of his rapidly growing global fame. The immense, paralyzing guilt of heavily endangering his 6 beloved brothers, combined with the crushing, relentless wave of malicious, targeted cyberbullying that seemingly wanted him completely erased from existence, drove him directly into a profound, terrifyingly isolating depression, where he heavily, seriously contemplated quietly stepping down from his vital, irreplaceable role as the leader, truly believing in his darkest moments that his mere presence was actively bringing dangerous, destructive darkness to the group he loved vastly more than his own life. He spent countless, agonizingly sleepless nights locked away in the freezing, suffocating isolation of his small production studio, known widely as the Archive, violently tearing at his own scribbled lyrics, profoundly questioning his fundamental worth as a human being, and battling severe, crippling anxiety that made the simple act of facing a massive, roaring crowd feel like stepping directly into a highly active, heavily mined war zone where his life could end in any moment. The intense, heavily publicized pressure completely broke him down to the absolute breaking point, where he later beautifully but tragically confessed in his raw, deeply vulnerable solo track, Always, that he fervently wished he was dead, brilliantly yet horrifyingly capturing the inescapable agony of waking up every single morning and desperately wishing the sun would just permanently stop rising. If Namjoon had actually surrendered to that suffocating, incredibly heavy darkness, if he had tragically allowed the malicious, terrifyingly violent threats and the relentless toxic industry hate to permanently silence his brilliant, world-changing voice, the entire monumental phenomenon of BTS would have instantly, irreparably, and completely collapsed into dust, entirely losing its fiercely intelligent, beating heart and the profound, deeply philosophical compass that brilliantly guides their world-shaking, legendary discography today. It was only through the incredibly fierce, unwavering, tear-filled support of his devoted members, who constantly reminded him of his irreplaceable value and his own staggering, awe-inspiring intellectual resilience, that he miraculously managed to painfully rebuild his shattered confidence from the absolute ground up. He powerfully, undeniably transformed his severe, paralyzing trauma into the breathtaking, deeply introspective lyrical genius that beautifully defines his phenomenal solo work and universally birthed the monumental, world-changing Love Yourself era, teaching millions how to heal precisely because he had to painfully figure out how to heal himself first. Every single time you hear him confidently, powerfully drop a legendary, heavily impactful verse on a massive stadium stage today, entirely unbothered by the blazing lights and the roaring crowds of millions, you are actively witnessing a man who bravely stood completely still in the terrifying, literal crosshairs of extreme, violent hatred, heavily felt the icy, paralyzing breath of death on his neck, and miraculously, powerfully chose to scream his beautiful, unyielding truth anyway. It is an unbelievably raw, deeply chilling testament to his unbreakable, ironclad spirit, forcefully leaving us completely breathless and heavily pondering an incredibly intense, deeply philosophical question. If the very dream you sacrificed absolutely everything to build suddenly transformed into a terrifying, highly credible threat to your actual physical existence, would you violently run for the quiet, safe shadows? Or would you bravely, stubbornly stand tall in the dangerous, blazing spotlight and fiercely dare the entire world to try and break you?
Number 2, V, the shattering illusion of stardom. Imagine possessing a presence so incredibly magnetic and a face so devastatingly flawless that the entire world literally crowns you as the most handsome man on the planet, yet every single time you look into the mirror, all you see is a hollow, deeply exhausted stranger staring back with dead, completely empty eyes. We all fiercely love and universally recognize Kim Tae-young, widely adored as V, as the absolute visual center of BTS, the soulful baritone whose incredibly deep, velvety voice can instantly melt millions of hearts, and the eccentric, free-spirited artist who constantly views the world through a beautifully unique, intensely creative lens. But beneath those spectacular, custom-made Gucci suits and that iconic, devastatingly charming boxy smile lay a terrifying, all-consuming psychological darkness that aggressively threatened to completely erase his identity and permanently destroy the entire group at the absolute dizzying peak of their monumental success. To truly comprehend the suffocating, life-shattering gravity of this horrifying internal crisis, we have to violently pull ourselves back to the wildly chaotic, incredibly overwhelming year of 2018, a period that is widely celebrated as the undeniable golden era of BTS, the exact moment they violently shattered the heavily guarded walls of the Western music industry, debuted at #1 on the Billboard charts, and undeniably conquered the entire globe with the monumental, world-shaking release of Fake Love and the Love Yourself series. But what the wildly cheering, completely oblivious public and the fiercely dedicated global army entirely failed to see was the absolute unadulterated nightmare unfolding in the terrifying, deeply isolating silence of their luxurious hotel rooms and private jets. While the world was loudly celebrating their historic, unprecedented victories, Taehyung was rapidly drowning in a profound, incredibly severe psychological burnout that completely stripped away his passion, his joy, and his very will to perform. The relentless, absolutely unforgiving, bone-crushing schedule demanded that they constantly travel across the planet, essentially living out of suitcases, constantly surrounded by massive, suffocating crowds, blinding camera flashes, and the incredibly heavy, paralyzing pressure of having to constantly project absolute, flawless perfection every single second of the day. For a naturally free-spirited, deeply sensitive soul like Taehyung, who thrives on genuine human connection, quiet moments of artistic reflection, and simple, ordinary joys, being violently shoved into this suffocating, heavily manufactured machine of global idol superstardom felt exactly like being buried alive. The extreme, unyielding physical exhaustion of performing highly demanding, aggressive choreography night after night flawlessly merged with a severe, crippling depression, violently plunging him into a dark, terrifying abyss where he completely lost touch with who he really was beneath the glittering, heavy idol makeup. In fact, in a deeply heartbreaking, heavily emotional later confession during a documentary, Taehyung bravely revealed the incredibly dark, horrifying depths of his desperation during this era, openly admitting that his mental state had deteriorated so catastrophically that he actually found himself secretly, desperately wishing he would get physically injured. Imagine the sheer, unimaginable magnitude of that psychological agony. A vibrant, deeply talented young man in his absolute prime, literally praying for a severe accident, a broken bone, or a debilitating injury, just so he could finally have a valid, unquestionable excuse to simply stop, breathe, and rest for a single day, without feeling the crushing, insurmountable guilt of letting down his members and millions of fans. He was essentially functioning as a beautiful, perfectly programmed robot, flawlessly hitting his marks on massive stadium stages, singing his heart out to roaring crowds of tens of thousands, while feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, terrifying numbness spreading through his veins. This catastrophic, deeply severe mental breaking point wasn't just an isolated personal struggle. It rapidly became a massive, highly toxic contagion that deeply affected the entire group, triggering a series of agonizing, intensely painful, tear-filled conversations in their dorms, where the 7 incredibly exhausted young men seriously, heavily debated permanently throwing in the towel, violently walking away from the massive empire they had literally bled to build, and disbanding BTS forever just to save their own fragile sanity. The sheer, terrifying reality that the biggest band in the entire world was secretly, desperately plotting their own escape route right when they had finally reached the absolute top of the mountain is a profoundly chilling, deeply sobering fact that completely shatters the beautiful, glittering illusion of ultimate fame. The absolute explosive climax of this agonizing, closely guarded secret violently erupted on the massive, highly publicized stage of the 2018 Mnet Asian Music Awards in Hong Kong, a night that will forever be etched into the very soul of the BTS fandom as one of the most painfully raw, incredibly vulnerable moments in the history of the entire music industry. When BTS was dramatically announced as the winner of the highly prestigious Artist of the Year award, what was supposed to be a standard, wildly celebratory acceptance speech instantly transformed into a deeply emotional, tear-soaked confession that shook the entire K-pop world to its absolute core. As Jin bravely took the microphone and unexpectedly, heavily confessed to the entire watching world that they had suffered so severely mentally that they had actively considered disbanding earlier that year, the massive, agonizing dam of carefully repressed emotions inside Taehyung violently, uncontrollably shattered into a million pieces. Right there, under the blinding, unforgiving glare of thousands of massive spotlights and millions of live television viewers, Taehyung completely lost his composure, breaking down into highly visceral, agonizingly painful, full-body sobs that physically shook his entire frame, desperately burying his tear-stained face in his hands, while Jimin immediately rushed over to hold him, tightly wrapping his arms around his profoundly broken, deeply exhausted brother. It was a fiercely cinematic, incredibly heartbreaking display of pure, unadulterated human vulnerability that violently ripped the mask off the idol industry, powerfully showing the entire world exactly how much blood, sweat, and literal agonizing tears are ruthlessly demanded in exchange for true global immortality. It took immense, staggering amounts of professional therapy, incredibly deep, agonizingly honest communication with his fiercely protective members, and a profound, fundamental shift in how the company managed their incredibly demanding schedules for Taehyung to slowly, painfully drag himself out of that suffocating, terrifyingly dark abyss.
He powerfully, undeniably channeled all of that agonizing, isolating pain directly into his breathtaking, deeply introspective art, brilliantly birthing hauntingly beautiful, heavily emotional solo masterpieces like Singularity and Blue and Gray, using his literal agonizing depression as the incredibly powerful ink to write songs that would ultimately heal millions of other profoundly broken souls around the world. Every single time you hear his remarkably deep, beautifully resonant voice completely commanding a song today, radiating an incredibly mature, grounded, and undeniably powerful artistic confidence, you are actively listening to a brilliant, unyielding survivor who literally stared directly into the terrifying, soul-crushing void of total burnout, violently fought the suffocating demons of unprecedented global fame, and miraculously, powerfully chose to stay alive and keep singing. It leaves us staring deeply into the incredibly harsh, heavily demanding reality of what we selfishly consume as mere entertainment, forcefully confronting us with a deeply provocative, incredibly challenging question that refuses to be easily answered. If achieving every single one of your wildest, most spectacular dreams actively required you to permanently sacrifice your own mind, your own freedom, and your fundamental will to live, would you still have the terrifying, reckless courage to blindly chase the crown, knowing exactly how heavy and completely suffocating it truly is?
Number 1. Jin, the paralyzing sparks of sacrifice. Imagine stepping into a fiercely competitive, violently cutthroat industry where every single person around you has been passionately singing and aggressively dancing since they were literally young children, while you were just a regular university student quietly studying acting, unexpectedly scouted off the street entirely because of your handsome face. We all universally adore Kim Sek-jin, widely celebrated globally as worldwide handsome, the incredibly witty, fiercely protective oldest brother of BTS, and the phenomenal silver voice whose soaring, highly emotional high notes can instantly bring an entire massive stadium to absolute echoing silence. But what the loudly cheering, starry-eyed public fundamentally failed to realize during the agonizingly difficult early years of BTS is that the incredibly heavy, suffocatingly dark burden of being labeled just the visual nearly shattered Jin's spirit entirely, violently pushing his physical body to a terrifying, potentially catastrophic breaking point that could have permanently ended his career and his mobility in a split second. To truly grasp the sheer, paralyzing magnitude of his deeply hidden struggles, we have to aggressively peel back the glittering, polished facade of his infectious, famous windshield wiper laugh and dive directly into the incredibly brutal, deeply unforgiving reality of a K-pop trainee who constantly felt like a massive, heavy anchor dragging his incredibly talented younger brothers down. While RM, Suga, and J-Hope were brilliant underground prodigies, and Jimin, V, and Jungkook were naturally gifted performers, Jin was forced to start from absolute terrifying zero, subjected to highly malicious, incredibly cruel cyberbullying from netizens and anti-fans who ruthlessly mocked his early dancing as stiff and awkward, viciously demanding that he be permanently removed from the group. The severe psychological torment of feeling completely inadequate drove Jin into a deeply concerning, dangerously obsessive practice routine. While the rest of the exhausted world was sleeping, he would completely lock himself inside the freezing, brightly lit dance studio, fiercely repeating the exact same bone-crushing, aggressive choreography for agonizingly long hours until his muscles violently cramped, his lungs fiercely burned, and his feet literally bled inside his shoes.
But his ultimate terrifying test of absolute unyielding survival didn't just come from the exhausting practice room. It violently erupted in the most horrifying, highly dangerous way possible in 2016, a remarkably pivotal, high-stakes year for BTS when they were aggressively fighting to secure their legendary blood, sweat, and tears and fire supremacy. During a massive, wildly crowded live broadcast performance at the heavily televised Busan One Asia Festival, the boys were passionately executing the incredibly intricate, fast-paced choreography when a sudden catastrophic technical malfunction violently occurred directly inside Jin's in-ear monitor. Right in the absolute middle of the high-energy performance, the heavy, highly intricate electrical earpiece violently sparked and malfunctioned, sending a literal blinding jolt of electricity and a deafening, agonizing pop directly into his ear canal. Imagine the sheer, unadulterated horror of a highly concentrated, sharp electric shock violently striking the incredibly sensitive, fragile nerves of your inner ear while you are physically surrounded by blinding pyrotechnics and deafening stadium speakers. For a terrifying, heart-stopping fraction of a second, Jin vividly winced, his handsome face violently contorting in absolute blinding agony, as his hand instinctively shot up to his completely numb, aggressively ringing ear. In that exact agonizing moment, any normal human being, or even a seasoned veteran artist, would have immediately dropped to the floor, violently ripped the defective, highly dangerous device out of their ear, and desperately signaled for emergency medical intervention to prevent severe, permanent hearing loss or catastrophic nerve damage. But this is exactly where the terrifyingly resilient, deeply unbreakable willpower of Kim Sek-jin violently defied all human logic and fiercely demonstrated exactly why he is the absolute unshakable pillar of BTS. Knowing that completely stopping the performance on a massive live national broadcast would profoundly jeopardize the incredibly fragile, hard-earned momentum of his 6 younger brothers, Jin stubbornly swallowed the fiery, ringing agony, miraculously masked his severe pain with a fierce, dangerously intense stare, and powerfully forced his shocked, trembling body to flawlessly execute every single remaining grueling second of the aggressive choreography without ever missing a single highly complex beat. The wildly cheering, completely oblivious audience had absolutely no idea that the incredibly stable, flawlessly performing visual center in front of them was actively enduring a literal, highly painful electrical burn inside his own head. But this incredibly dangerous, heart-stopping incident wasn't even the only terrifying medical crisis he silently swallowed that exact same year. Earlier, during the wildly massive KCON Paris 2016 event, Jin suffered a severe, debilitating cervical neck injury right before stepping onto the stage. The muscles and delicate nerves around his spine completely locked up in agonizing, paralyzing spasms, plunging him into such immense, blinding pain that he was literally weeping in the cramped, chaotic backstage area, heavily surrounded by deeply panicked medical staff who aggressively warned him that executing the notorious, violently aggressive, neck-breaking choreography of Fire could result in catastrophic, permanent spinal damage or terrifying, irreversible paralysis. Once again, violently faced with the terrifying choice of saving his own physical body or profoundly disappointing his beloved brothers and the massive waiting global audience, Jin fiercely wiped his tears, aggressively rejected the medical advice to sit out, heavily strapped his neck with invisible medical tape, and bravely marched straight into the blinding stage lights. He powerfully delivered a legendary, explosive performance, commanding the stage with such intense, fiery charisma that nobody in the roaring crowd could possibly tell that every single sharp head turn was sending jagged, fiery knives of sheer, paralyzing agony straight down his spinal cord.
The incredibly heavy, agonizing aftermath of these deeply terrifying, highly dangerous incidents fundamentally cemented Jin's absolutely irreplaceable, monumental role in the group, powerfully transforming him from the deeply insecure, inexperienced oldest brother into the ultimate unbreakable shield who silently, fiercely absorbs the heaviest, most agonizing blows so that his younger siblings can continue to fly. The other incredibly perceptive members eventually fully recognized the staggering, highly dangerous physical and emotional sacrifices he constantly made in the dark, and their profound, tear-filled gratitude completely shifted the fundamental dynamic of BTS forever, violently cementing an unbreakable, heavily bonded brotherhood forged in literal, agonizing fire. His awe-inspiring, profoundly cinematic metamorphosis from a heavily criticized, deeply insecure acting student who couldn't catch a beat into a globally revered, highly untouchable vocal powerhouse who literally risked his own hearing and permanent physical mobility just to keep the group's dream alive is nothing short of pure, unadulterated legend. It forcefully shatters the shallow, incredibly toxic idol industry narrative that visual members are merely empty, talentless shells, powerfully proving that true, undeniable superstardom is brutally forged not just in natural, effortless talent, but in the terrifying, unyielding courage to violently endure unimaginable, deeply isolating pain without ever letting the world see you bleed. Every single time you hear his breathtakingly stable, incredibly clear voice completely dominating a massive stadium today, projecting an aura of absolute, effortless confidence and supreme, unbothered joy, you are actively witnessing a man who bravely stood completely still amidst blinding pain, terrifying electrical shocks, and the crushing, agonizing weight of global expectations, and miraculously, powerfully chose to smile anyway. It aggressively leaves us completely breathless, deeply pondering a highly intense, incredibly provocative question that demands deep, heavy reflection. If you were constantly labeled as the absolute weakest link in a team of brilliant, untouchable prodigies, would you silently allow that suffocating, crushing pressure to completely break you? Or would you bravely, stubbornly walk directly through the literal blinding fire to fiercely forge yourself into their unbreakable, undeniably irreplaceable anchor?